Boys missing from an Appalachian village in 1976 reappeared 15 years later with something unexplained. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is the documented account of what happened in Hollow Creek, West Virginia, a place where families had lived in isolation for generations, where the mountain roads led nowhere and where 3 young boys vanished without a trace on a cold November evening. Hollow Creek sits deep in the Appalachian Mountains, accessible only by a single unpaved road that winds through dense forest and rocky terrain. In 1976, fewer than 200 people called this place home. Most families had been there since the 1800s. The Whitakers, the Cools, the Hensleys. Names that appeared over and over in church records, birth certificates, marriage licenses. The same surnames, generation after generation. The village had no police station, no hospital. The nearest town was 40 miles away over treacherous mountain passes. It became impossible in winter. Mail arrived once a week. Electricity had only come to Hollow Creek in 1968. Many homes still used oil, lamps, and wood stoves. November 14th, 1976. A Saturday. The temperature had dropped to 32 by late afternoon. Daniel Whitaker, Ahed 12. His cousin Marcus Whitaker, Ahed 11, and Joseph Cole, age 13. 3 boys who had grown up together, played together, attended the one-room schoolhouse together. They left Joseph's house around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Joseph's mother, Martha Cole, remembered them heading toward the old quarry, a place the boys often explored despite warnings from their parents. The quarry had been abandoned since the 1920s, its depths filled with dark water that reflected the gray Appalachian sky. When darkness fell at 6 o'clock and the boys had not returned, Martha walked to the Whitaker house. Daniel and Marcus's father, Thomas Whitaker, organized a search party. 15 men carrying lanterns and flashlights spread through the woods, calling the boys' names into the cold mountain air. They searched all night. They searched the next day, and the next. The quarry was dragged. Every abandoned cabin, every cave, every hollow within 5 miles was examined. State police arrived on the 3rd day with tracking dogs. The dogs lost the scent near the quarry's edge, circled 3 times, and sat down, refusing to continue. No bodies were found, no clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if the boys had simply stepped off the edge of the world. The investigation revealed something that made national newspapers uncomfortable. Thomas Whitaker was married to his second cousin, Sarah Whitaker. Their family tree showed multiple marriages between Whitakers going back 5 generations. Martha Cole's husband, Robert, was her 3rd cousin. The Hensleys had similar patterns. Joseph Cole's grandmother had been a Whitaker before marriage. Reporters from Charleston and even a television crew from Pittsburgh arrived in Hollow Creek. They documented the isolated community, the intermarried families, the children who bore the physical marks of close genetic relationships. Several residents had noticeable developmental differences. Speech impediments were common. 3 families had children with distinctive facial features that medical professionals later identified as consistent with generational consanguineous relationships. The media attention brought shame to Hollow Creek. Families who had lived quietly for generations suddenly found their lives examined, judged, sensationalized. The state of West Virginia appointed a social worker to visit the village monthly. Some families refused to speak to outsiders. Others left, moving to larger towns where their family histories were unknown. By Christmas, 1976, the search had been officially suspended. The 3 boys were presumed dead, though their bodies were never recovered. Memorial services were held at the Hollow Creek Baptist Church, a small wooden building where 4 generations of Whitakers, Cools, and Hensleys had been baptized, married, and mourned. Years passed. The families grieved. Thomas and Sarah Whitaker had no other children. Martha Cole had a daughter born 3 years after Joseph disappeared. The village slowly returned to its isolated existence, though the pain of loss never truly faded. The old quarry became a place of memory. Flowers were left at its edge every November 14th. Parents warned their children away from it with new urgency. The story of the missing boys became part of Hollow Creek's identity, whispered about but rarely discussed in detail. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what you are about to discover in the next chapters will challenge everything you thought you knew about isolated communities and the secrets they keep buried for generations. Spring 1991, 15 years after the disappearance. Friday afternoon in early May, when the mountain laurel bloomed pink and white across the hillsides. A state highway patrol officer named David Richardson was driving Route 52, the main road that passed 20 meters from Hollow Creek. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, he noticed 3 men walking along the shoulder. They wore outdated clothing, jeans, and flannel shirts that looked decades old. Their hair was long and unkempt. They walked slowly, as if uncertain of their direction. Officer Richardson pulled over. The men stopped walking. They looked at him with expressions he later described as confused and frightened. When he approached, they backed away. "Are you gentlemen all right?" Richardson asked. "Do you need assistance?" The tallest of the 3 spoke. His voice was rough, unused. Where is Hollow Creek?" Richardson studied them more carefully. They appeared to be in their mid-20s, but something about them seemed wrong. Their movements were hesitant. Their eyes dotted around as if seeing the world for the first time. "Hollow Creek is about 20 miles east," Richardson said. "Are you from there?" "We need to go home," the tall one said. "We need to see our families." Richardson asked for identification. None of them had any. He asked their names. The tall one said, "Daniel Whitaker." The second said, "Marcus Whitaker." The third, shorter and thinner, said Joseph Cole. Officer Richardson had been stationed in the area for 8 years. He knew the story of the missing boys. Everyone in southern West Virginia knew that story. Those boys disappeared in 1976, Richardson said carefully. 15 years ago, they would have been children. "We are them," Daniel said. "We need to go home." Richardson called for backup. Within 30 minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived along with an ambulance. The 3 men were transported to Monroe County Hospital. Medical examinations were conducted. Fingerprints were taken from records preserved from the 1976 investigation, prints taken from the boys' school books and personal belongings. The fingerprints matched. Daniel Whitaker, Marcus Whitaker, and Joseph Cole had returned. But they had aged 15 years in what they claimed was no time at all, and they had no memory of where they had been. News spread through Hollow Creek within hours. Thomas and Sarah Whitaker drove to the hospital, their hands shaking as they walked down the corridor to the room where their son waited. Cole came with her husband, Robert, who had aged significantly in the 15 years since his son's disappearance. The reunions were documented by hospital staff, though out of respect, no media was allowed inside. Thomas Whitaker later told investigators that when he saw Daniel, his first reaction was shock. This was not a 12-year-old boy. This was a 27-year-old man with his son's face, his son's eyes, his son's voice now deepened by time. "Dad," Daniel said. "What happened to you? You look old." Sarah Whitaker collapsed. She had to be treated for shock and dehydration. The 3 men were kept at the hospital for observation. Doctors found them physically healthy, though undernourished. Their dental records matched those from 1976, but showed 15 years of normal wear. Their bodies had aged naturally. Blood tests, brain scans, everything indicated they were exactly who they claimed to be. 15 years older than when they disappeared. But their minds told a different story. When questioned separately, all 3 gave identical accounts. Remembered leaving Joseph's house. They remembered walking toward the quarry. They remembered darkness falling suddenly, though it had been afternoon. And then they remembered waking up on the side of Route 52, wearing the same clothes they had worn in 1976, feeling as though no time had passed. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered. Dr. Helen Morrison, a specialist in dissociative disorders from Charleston, spent 3 days interviewing the men. Her official report stated that all 3 exhibited genuine confusion about the time loss, showed no signs of deception, no signs of rehearsed stories. They truly believed they had been gone for hours, not years. The case attracted immediate national attention. Television crews returned to Hollow Creek. Newspapers ran headlines about the Appalachian mystery. Theories ranged from government experiments to mass hallucination to elaborate hoaxes. But the families knew their children, despite the impossible circumstances. Thomas and Sarah brought Daniel home to Hollow Creek. Martha and Robert brought Joseph home. Marcus returned to the Whitaker family home, where his younger sister, now married with children of her own, struggled to understand how her older brother could be younger than she was. The men tried to reintegrate into the village, but Hollow Creek had changed. The 1976 media attention had brought outside scrutiny that never fully disappeared. Some families had left. The school had closed in 1985, with the remaining children bused to a consolidated school in the county seat. The church still stood, but the congregation had dwindled, and the three men themselves were changed in ways that became apparent slowly. They had difficulty with modern technology. Television confused them. Cars frightened them. They preferred to stay inside, away from the world that had moved on without them. Federal investigators arrived in Hollow Creek in June 1991. The FBI opened a case file. The Centers for Disease Control sent a team to examine whether environmental factors in the isolated community might explain the phenomenon. Geneticists came to study the population's unique family structures. What they discovered went far beyond the mystery of the missing boys. Hollow Creek's isolation had created something documented in only a handful of places worldwide. Dr. Richard Peaton, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University, spent 3 months in the village collecting family histories and medical records. His findings were published in a controversial 1992 paper that was later suppressed by the university. The paper documented 7 generations of intermarriage among fewer than 30 family lines. The genetic diversity of Hollow Creek's population was comparable to endangered species with critically small breeding populations. Dr. Patan identified multiple genetic markers associated with recessive disorders. He found unusually high rates of developmental differences, physical anomalies, and cognitive variations. But he found something else, something that made his research troubling to the scientific community. The Whitaker, Cole, and Hensley families showed a genetic mutation that had never been documented before. It affected their neurochemistry in ways that Dr. Peaton could not fully explain. Blood samples from 43 residents showed the same mutation. It was present in Daniel, Marcus, and Joseph. The mutation affected their perception of time. Dr. Margaret Chun, a neurologist brought in to consult on the case, conducted extensive testing. Brain scans showed unusual activity in the regions responsible for processing temporal information. All 3 men demonstrated significant difficulty with time estimation tasks. When asked to count 60 seconds, Daniel counted 297. Marcus counted to 112. Joseph stopped at 73. Their internal clocks are broken, Dr. Chin reported. Or rather, they operate on a different scale than typical human perception. The theory developed by the research team was extraordinary and disturbing. The generational consanguinity had created a population with altered neurological function. The genetic isolation had allowed a mutation to concentrate in the population. That mutation affected how their brains processed the passage of time. The quarry became the focus of investigation. Geological surveys revealed unusual mineral deposits in the rock formations. The water had high concentrations of radon and other radioactive elements. Local environmental conditions combined with the population's unique genetics might have created circumstances under which the boys experienced a genuine temporal displacement. They had not traveled through time. They had experienced it differently. For the 3 men, 15 years had passed in what felt like a single disorienting moment. Their bodies aged normally, but their conscious experience had been compressed, folded, altered by the combination of their genetic makeup and environmental exposure. The scientific papers were published in obscure journals. The mainstream media lost interest when the explanation proved too complex and too disturbing to sensationalize effectively. The genetic implications were troubling. The ethics of studying an isolated population were questioned. The research teams left Hollow Creek, but the 3 men remained, trapped between the moment they disappeared and the world they returned to. Right now, pause for a moment and leave a comment saying, time stole their childhood, but could not erase their existence. This story deserves to be remembered. Share this with someone who needs to understand the truth is stranger than any fiction. Daniel Whitaker struggled most visibly. He had been 12 years old in his mind when he woke up in 1991. His parents had aged 39 and 41 years old, 254 and 56. His childhood home felt alien. He had missed his entire adolescence, his teenage years. His early 20s he tried to work. The village had few jobs, but Thomas Whitaker still maintained a small farm. Daniel worked alongside his father, learning again how to perform tasks he had known as a boy, but his hands were now adult hands. His body was strong where it had been small. Everything felt wrong. Marcus withdrew almost completely. He spent most days in his childhood bedroom, now filled with belongings of a niece he had never met. His sister tried to help him adjust. But how do you explain to someone that they have lost 15 years, when their experience says they have lost nothing? Joseph showed signs of severe dissociation. Dr. Morrison continued to visit him monthly, documenting his psychological decline. He began to insist that 1991 was not real, that he was still 12 years old, that he would wake up soon and find everything back to normal. As the three men struggled to adapt, researchers examining Hollow Creek's historical records made a chilling discovery. This was not the first time. County archives in the basement of the courthouse, 30 miles from Hollow Creek, contained reports dating back to 1847. That year, 2 young girls from the Hensley family disappeared while playing near the same quarry. They were found 6 weeks later, wandering the mountain road, unable to explain where they had been. The girls both showed signs of aging beyond the 6 weeks they had been missing. Medical records from that era were primitive, but the doctor's notes described them as having grown in ways not natural for the passage of mere weeks. In 1889, a boy named Thomas Coe vanished from Hollow Creek. He returned 3 years later, claiming only days had passed. He was committed to an asylum where he died in 1891. In 1923, 4 children disappeared. 3 returned after 8 months. They had aged 3 years. The 4th was never found. The pattern was consistent. Every 20 to 30 years, children from the intermarried families disappeared near the quarry. Most returned, but with time distortions. Their bodies aged more or less than the calendar time that passed, and all of them carried the genetic mutation that Dr. Pemberton had identified. The quarry itself became the subject of intensive geological and environmental study. Core samples revealed that the mineral composition created a natural low-level radioactive field. When combined with specific weather conditions, typically in late fall, the radiation levels spiked. Researchers theorized that children with the genetic mutation, when exposed to these spikes, EXPERIENCED, neurological effects that fundamentally altered their perception and experience of time. It was not supernatural. It was biology meeting geology in a way that produced effects indistinguishable from the impossible. The state of West Virginia quietly purchased the land surrounding the quarry in 1993. Fences were erected, warning signs posted. The official explanation was environmental contamination. The truth was buried in classified reports that few people would ever read. But for the families of Hollow Creek, the damage was already done. Daniel Whitaker never truly adjusted to life in 1991. On November 14, 1994, exactly 18 years after his disappearance, he walked to the quarry. He climbed the fence. His body was found in the water 3 days later. The autopsy reported drowning. No note was found. His parents buried him in the Hollow Creek Cemetery next to the memorial stone they had placed in 1976. Marcus Whitaker moved to Charleston in 1995. He worked construction jobs, never staying anywhere longer than a few months. He avoided relationships. He never spoke about his experience. In 2003, he died in a workplace accident. He was 38 years old, but he had lived only 27 years of conscious experience. Joseph Cole remained in Hollow Creek. Martha and Robert cared for him as their health declined. He never worked. He never married. He spent his days sitting on the porch of the house he had left as a 13-year-old boy, watching a world he did not understand and could not accept. In 2008, Martha Cole died of heart failure. Robert followed 6 months later. Joseph was placed in a group home in the county seat. He died there in 2011, age 58, having never reconciled the boy he felt himself to be with the man his body had become. The researchers moved on to other projects. The papers were forgotten. Hollow Creek continued its slow decline. By 2020, fewer than 50 people remained in the village. Most were elderly. The young had left 4 cities where their family histories were unknown and their genetics were less concentrated. The church closed in 2015. The school building, empty for decades, collapsed in a windstorm in 2018. Quarry remained fenced, its dark water holding secrets that science had explained but could never truly resolve. Today, Hollow Creek is nearly abandoned. A handful of houses still show signs of occupation. The Whitaker name appears on 3 mailboxes. 1 Cole family remains. The intermarried generations that created the genetic isolation have mostly dispersed. But the story of the boys who disappeared in 1976 and returned in 1991 remains. It exists in scientific papers that few read, in news archives that fewer remember, in the memories of people who witnessed something that challenged their understanding of reality. The case raises questions that extend beyond one Appalachian village. Across isolated communities worldwide, similar patterns of consanguinity have created unique genetic populations. Mountain villages in the Alps, island communities in the Pacific, remote settlements in the Andes. Each carries the potential for genetic mutations that could manifest in unexpected ways. The Hollow Creek mutation affected time perception. What other mutations might exist in other isolated populations? What other biological variations might arise from generations of genetic isolation? These questions remain largely unexplored. The ethics of studying such communities are complex. The potential for exploitation is high. The balance between scientific knowledge and human dignity is delicate. But the boys who disappeared and returned remind us that reality operates according to rules we do not fully understand, that the human body, shaped by generations of specific genetic inheritance, can develop capabilities and vulnerabilities that defy simple explanation. Daniel, Marcus, and Joseph were not victims of anything supernatural. They were products of their biology and their environment. Their tragedy was that they were born into circumstances that made them vulnerable to an experience that isolated them from the flow of time that everyone else shares. Their families loved them. Their community mourned them. But neither love nor community could bridge the gap between the subjective experience of time and its objective passage. The quarry still sits in the mountains of West Virginia. The water still reflects the gray Appalachian sky. The radiation still pulses through the rocks, following patterns that have existed for millions of years. Indifferent to the human lives it has touched, Hollow Creek itself will likely disappear within another generation. The houses will collapse. The roads will be reclaimed by forest. The family names that appeared on documents for 200 years will fade from memory. But the story will remain a reminder that isolation has consequences. That genetic diversity is not just a scientific concept, but a necessity for human populations. That the choices made by one generation echo through those that follow in ways that cannot always be predicted or prevented. The three boys who vanished in 1976 and returned in 1991 left no children. Their genetic lines ended with them. The mutation that altered their perception of time will not continue unless it appears again spontaneously in the few remaining families of Hollow Creek. Science explained what happened to them, but explanation does not diminish tragedy. Understanding the mechanism does not ease the pain of parents who watch their 12-year-old son become a 7-year-old stranger. Knowledge does not comfort the man who lost 15 years of life in a single disorienting moment. The boys missing from an Appalachian village in 1976 reappeared 15 years later with something unexplained. Not a supernatural curse, not a government conspiracy, but something perhaps more disturbing. A demonstration that human biology, when shaped by isolation and circumstance, can create experiences that seem impossible yet are entirely real. Their story ends here in the empty mountains where it began. But the questions it raises continue about community, about genetics, about the nature of time and consciousness, about what it means to be human in a world where our biology can make us strangers to our own lives. If you watched until here, you are part of a community that values truth over comfort, knowledge over ignorance. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like these need to be preserved and shared. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and recognize who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit the like button if this story impacted you. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the most disturbing mysteries are often rooted in human reality, not fantasy. The boys of Hollow Creek deserve to be remembered not as a mystery, but as a warning about what happens when isolation and genetics collide in ways we barely understand.